It's really about treating people with dignity and respect, above all else, at the highest level. It's that we see each other as necessary, we value one another.
Sir, is this the professional policing policy?
Yes, it is. Be courteous, respectful, polite, and professional. Ensure that the length of any detention is no longer than necessary to take appropriate action for the known or suspected offense.
Fair to say that law enforcement generally has changed a lot since you started back in 1989, is that right?
That is correct.
1989, you didn't have body-worn cameras, correct?
That is correct.
And nor did you have sort of the ability for civilians, bystanders, to video or record conduct of police officers, right?
We did not.
Because we didn't have smartphones.
That's true.
And now we do.
Yes.
And as you indicated, the policies and culture of the police department has to change with the times, is that right?
Yes.
And so in terms of understanding that sometimes bystanders do use their smartphones to take video images of police officers, has the Minneapolis Police Department imparted any training or constructed any policies to prepare officers for people recording them?
Yes, we have. We've imparted policy that really is informing officers that individuals, under their First Amendment rights, they have the absolute First Amendment right to record through cell phone video or other types of video, officers interacting or engaging with a community member, with the exception that they cannot obstruct the activity of the officers, but they absolutely have the right, barring that, to record us performing our duties.
And what does obstruct mean in this context?
Obstruct would mean interfering, doing something where you are physically placing yourself in a position where you're prohibiting the officers for carrying out their lawful duties. But barring that, individuals have the right to record our engagement with our community.
Well, Chief, you'd have to acknowledge that a patrol officer may find it irritating to have a civilian recording their activities. True?
Very true.
Is that obstruction?
It is not.
And again, this is the public recording of police activities, providing employees guidance with dealing with members of the public, recording them. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And generally, this informs officers that unless you're being obstructed, people get to record you.
Yes.
Even if you don't like it.
That is correct.
And how long has this been policy of MPD?
Since May of 2016. Legislation is providing a knowledge base or skills, in this case for officers, to really focus on time, options, and resources. It's really primarily trying to provide an opportunity to stabilize a situation, to de-escalate it, and with the goal is having a safe and peaceful outcome. And so there's tools associated with that, but that's really the goal of de-escalation. Time, options, and resources, so that we can stabilize the situation peacefully and safely.
When you think of de-escalation, are you thinking of it as the sort of the opposite of using force, or is it a part of using force?
We teach it as both.
And when you started with the department back in 1989, was there an emphasis on de-escalation?
It was not mentioned. It's not heard of back then.
Okay. When did de-escalation start becoming more of a topic of conversation in law enforcement communities?
I think that right around late 90s, 2000, I think that when when there was attention, not only in Minneapolis, but in departments across the country, and incidents particularly involving police encounters with those who were suffering from mental illness, we really started to see a lot of work on that. Here locally, the Barbara Schneider Foundation, there was a very tragic incident in Minneapolis many years ago that involved the death of a community member. But when we started, that was really what kind of culminated for our department, de-escalation. And even when you heard departments starting to talk about other tools like tasers, all of these types of things, it was around that time frame that I think our department really started getting a lot more education, awareness, and training as it relates to de-escalation.
So what about in your own experience when you were on patrol? Did you use de-escalation techniques?
Yes, quite a bit. Yes.
And did you find them to be effective, a way to maybe talk somebody down from a situation rather than needing to use force?
Yes, and with the primary goal is that you want to keep yourself safe as an officer, and you also want to keep the community safe. And so a lot of it hinged on communication and listening and verbal skills. And so if you could talk your way out of a situation to de-escalate where it didn't have to result in physical force, those were things you certainly utilized, and you were always in a better position to look upon someone that you worked with who had that skill set to do that.
But if you can't talk somebody out of the situation, if you can't de-escalate, you can't, right? And you have to then use a different method.
That is true.
And so it really comes to what's reasonable at the time. Is that right?
Yes.
Does Minneapolis Police Department currently have a de-escalation policy?
We do.
And at this time, if I can, Police Department Policy 5-304, threatening the use of force and de-escalation. This is the policy, and it's a policy as it existed on May 25, 2020. Is that right?
That is correct.
If we could highlight the first paragraph A, threatening the use of force.
As an alternative and/or the precursor to the actual use of force, MPD officers shall consider verbally announcing their intent to use force, including displaying an authorized weapon as a threat of force, when reasonable under the circumstances.
Is it an either-or alternative? Is it like you either de-escalate or use force, and once you start using force, you just give up on de-escalation?
The goal is to resolve the situation as safely as possible. So you want to always have de-escalation layered into those actions of using force.
When reasonable, whenever reasonable, shall use de-escalation tactics to gain voluntary compliance. Is that right?
Yes.
And to seek to avoid or to minimize the use of physical force, correct?
Yes.
And seeking to minimize physical force, that can be happening while physical force is being employed, can't it?
Yes.
An officer could be using physical force, and during the course of that, still maintain attempts to de-escalate and defuse the situation.
Yes. Stabilize the situation so that more time, options, and resources are available.
Officers are required to consider, and if you could highlight, officers under the Minneapolis de-escalation policy are required to consider whether the subject's lack of compliance is a deliberate attempt to resist or an inability. Is that right?
Yes.
And if you could read, first, the first bullet is medical conditions, correct?
Yes.
We have mental impairment, developmental disability, physical limitation. Some of you may just be physically unable to comply, correct?
Yes.
Language barrier, and if you're not considering that, perhaps the situation could escalate into something greater than it would need to be.
Yes. One of the other considerations officers should take into account is the influence of drug or alcohol use.
How so?
We know the research says that people can react differently when they're under the use of alcohol or drugs. And so you trying to get verbal commands, if someone's under the use of alcohol or drugs or you're doing force, it may have a different reaction to them. So that should be something that you should be considering.
Sir, drug or alcohol use, in this context is being required that the officer consider to determine if de-escalation is appropriate. it can be true that some people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol can become dangerous, correct?
That is correct.
But isn't it also true that some people react completely different and they are not necessarily dangerous if they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs?
That is correct.
In fact, they may not be more dangerous, they may actually be more vulnerable.
True.
And it's important that the officer considers that when determining whether to go the route of force or continued force or de-escalation. Fair?
Yes.
Behavioral crisis is the last bullet I'd like you to discuss. What do you mean by behavioral crisis?
Behavioral crisis, of all the bullets, sometimes that is probably the one that our men and women experience in our communities most. If someone loses a job, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. If someone loses a loved one, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. If someone has themselves got the worst diagnosis from their doctor that day, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. And so we want our folks to take all of those things into consideration. When I talk about meeting our community where they are, that's probably the one that we need to really focus on. Yeah.
And as you testified earlier, the police just don't get to meet people on their very best day, do they?
No, they don't.
And the behavioral crisis, as the kind you've described here, can in fact be a barrier to compliance. It would cause an inability to comply, even if not, an intentional inability to comply. That's fair.
Let's go to list,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so the purpose of the listing a behavioral crisis as a point of consideration for a law enforcement officer is what?
Again, it's recognizing that when we get the call from our communities, it may not often be their best day, and they may be experiencing something that is very traumatic. But we're going to respond, but we have to take that into consideration because, as I mentioned again, we may be the first and last time they have an interaction with a Minneapolis police officer, and so we have to make it count. It matters.